Nothing dramatic happened, and that is precisely why it mattered. No emergency summit, no slammed doors, no headline screaming crisis. Canada simply said no, calmly, procedurally, and without hesitation, and then moved on. That quiet refusal carried more weight than any public confrontation because institutional power does not announce itself when it is confident. It signals. For decades, Washington operated on a stable assumption. Proximity guarantees compliance. Pressure accelerates agreement. Allies bend before timelines harden. This time, that assumption failed not loudly, but conclusively. Canada did not reject a deal theatrically. It rejected the logic behind it. And when a deeply integrated ally with every incentive to agree chooses delay over concession, something structural has already shifted beneath the surface. This was not defiance. It was recalibration. Institutions do not react to tone or personalities. They react to risk, memory, and credibility. And when credibility thins, speed becomes dangerous. If you want to understand how power actually works today, not how it's performed, but how it's processed, stay with me, because this moment wasn't a breakdown. It was a diagnostic, and what it revealed reshapes everything that follows. To understand why this refusal mattered, we have to be precise about what was actually at stake. This was not a routine trade disagreement. It was not a technical dispute over clauses or percentages. It was the central proof point of a broader negotiating strategy, the belief that pressure applied visibly and personally still forces outcomes. For years, this strategy relied on a simple equation. Asymmetry equals leverage. Canada was expected to comply not because the terms were ideal, but because the cost of resisting a powerful neighbor was assumed to be higher than the cost of accepting uncertainty. That assumption had history behind it. It had worked before. And that is what made this moment dangerous for Washington. Because when an assumption works for too long, it stops being questioned. It becomes invisible. Institutions begin to treat it as structural truth rather than conditional reality. Canada's decision quietly challenged that truth. It suggested that the calculus had changed not politically, but institutionally. This is the critical distinction. Deals do not fail because of personalities. They fail when enforcement capacity, reputational capital, and future expectations stop aligning. And once that alignment breaks, no amount of urgency can repair it quickly. To see how we arrived here, we have to step backward into the system that made this refusal not just possible, but inevitable. For most of the post-war era, the U.S.-Canada relationship rested on a quiet but powerful premise. Disagreements were temporary, but the framework was permanent. Trade disputes came and went. Leaders changed. Rhetoric flared and cooled. Yet beneath all of it, institutions on both sides operated with a shared expectation of continuity. Agreements, once signed, were assumed to hold. That assumption functioned as invisible capital. It lowered risk. It accelerated compromise. It allowed Canada to absorb pressure without fundamentally revising its strategy, because the end state was predictable. Even when Washington pushed hard, Ottawa believed the floor would remain stable. But that premise did not collapse all at once. It eroded procedurally, then reputationally. Agreements began behaving less like anchors and more like drafts, subject to reopening, reframing, or public renegotiation. From an institutional perspective, this mattered far more than any single tariff or threat. When commitments lose durability, compliance becomes more expensive, planning slows, investment hesitates, risk premiums rise, Canada's policy apparatus is built to notice exactly these signals. It is conservative by design, prioritizing predictability over upside, stability over spectacle. By the time this deal arrived, the old rhythm was already breaking. What looked like a sudden refusal was, in reality, the delayed outcome of years of accumulated institutional learning. And that learning was about to surface not as theory, but as crisis. The first rupture didn't arrive as a crisis. It arrived as a moment of clarity. The deal on the table was framed as decisive a demonstration that pressure still worked when applied forcefully and publicly. It was meant to validate a model, escalate compressed timelines, force closure. Canada was expected to fold. not because the terms were generous, but because delay was assumed to be more costly than agreement. Instead, delay became the signal. Canada didn't reject the deal emotionally or ideologically, it rejected it procedurally. Language was careful, posture was calm, but the meaning was unmistakable. Under the new assumptions Washington was operating on, the internal math no longer worked. Compliance no longer guaranteed closure. Concessions no longer bought predictability. That is the moment leverage cracked. When institutions conclude that waiting is safer than signing, power has already shifted. What appears to be a stalled negotiation is actually a diagnostic event. It reveals which side believes time is an enemy and which side understands time as an asset. Washington needed this deal symbolically, Canada did not. And that asymmetry mattered more than tariffs or headlines. If this was the first visible fracture, the next phase would show how systems respond when pressure stops producing movement. What mattered next was not the rejection itself, but the mechanism beneath it. Washington treated leverage as a substitute for trust. Pressure replaced persuasion. Unpredictability was framed as advantage. This approach can work when the pressured party believes the end state is fixed and the pain is temporary. But institutions do not respond to pressure the way individuals do. They respond to sequences. From Ottawa's perspective, the critical question shifted. It was no longer, can we survive this deal? It became, what precedent does this deal establish? If accepting terms today encourages harder terms tomorrow, then agreement is not resolution, it is exposure. Institutions think forward, not laterally. They optimize for tomorrow's negotiation, not today's headline. This is where Washington misread the system. It assumed proximity guaranteed compliance. It assumed asymmetry guaranteed leverage. It assumed Canada's dependence outweighed its tolerance for uncertainty. That calculation used to be correct. But tolerance for uncertainty had changed quietly, structurally, and irreversibly. Canada's institutions had learned that volatility raises the cost of speed. When commitments feel provisional, the rational response is insulation, not escalation. Delay becomes protection. Caution becomes strategy. And once that logic takes hold, pressure no longer accelerates agreement. It slows it down. The next phase would prove just how far that recalibration had already gone. The second escalation was quieter, but far more consequential. Canada did not decouple. That would have been unrealistic. Instead, it de-risked. Options widened. Dependencies were reassessed. Supply chains were stress-tested. Trade pathways beyond the United States were reinforced not to replace Washington, but to reduce the cost of saying no. This was not retaliation, it was insurance. Washington underestimated this shift because it was largely invisible. There were no dramatic announcements, no symbolic breaks, but institutions had already adjusted their baseline. Dependence still existed, but tolerance for uncertainty had dropped. And that distinction changed everything. From the U.S. side, urgency was treated as strength. Deadlines were meant to concentrate attention. Public framing was meant to narrow options. Speed became virtue. Inside Canadian institutions, the same signals were read differently. Urgency suggested asymmetry. If one side needs closure more than the other, the side that can wait quietly gains leverage. This is where pressure stopped functioning as intended. Unpredictability no longer created advantage, it created long-term risk. And when risk rises, institutions slow down, widen review, escalate internally. What looks like resistance is often just governance doing its job. By this point, the negotiation was no longer about terms. It was about time. And time was no longer Washington's ally. That recalibration was about to move beyond governments and land directly on people. This is where the story reaches you. Because institutional recalibration never stays abstract. It moves downstream. When agreements stall, uncertainty doesn't remain in briefing rooms. It shows up in prices, in jobs postponed, in investments delayed, in decisions that never quite get made. You feel it not as crisis, but as friction. From the outside, nothing looks broken. Markets don't crash. Borders stay open. But underneath, the cost of hesitation accumulates. Businesses plan more cautiously. Supply chains add buffers. Contracts shorten or hedge. Risk premiums quietly rise. None of this is dramatic. All of it is real. And here is the uncomfortable truth. Institutions choose this friction deliberately when predictability disappears. They would rather absorb diffuse, manageable costs than lock in a deal that teaches the wrong lesson. From their perspective, a bad precedent is more dangerous than a slow quarter. So when you hear that a deal failed quietly, understand what that really means. It means systems decided that delay was safer than certainty, that patience was cheaper than compliance, that waiting protected future leverage better than agreement protected today. If you felt the world moving more slowly, more cautiously, this is part of why. Not chaos, adjustment. And once institutions internalize that adjustment, they don't rush to reverse it. Because what follows is no longer domestic, it's global. When one close ally learns that waiting is survivable, others take note, not because they coordinate, and not because anyone announces a shift. Institutions observe patterns. They watch outcomes. They adjust quietly. Canada's refusal did not trigger rebellion. It triggered caution. And caution compounds across systems. Other capitals began approaching negotiations differently. Legal buffers thickened. Review timelines lengthened. Commitments became more conditional. Not hostile, just hedged. Trust didn't vanish, but it became more expensive. Predictability, once assumed, now had to be demonstrated repeatedly. This is how influence erodes in the modern system. Not through confrontation, but through drift. When deals fail loudly, systems mobilize to fix them. When they fail quietly, systems adapt around the failure. Multilateral frameworks gain weight. Documentation multiplies. Informal shortcuts disappear. Washington still had power. But power exercised through urgency began producing hesitation instead of compliance. Markets noticed before politics did. Volatility didn't spike. Capital didn't flee. It adjusted. Risk was redistributed toward partners perceived as predictable rather than forceful. Nothing collapsed, but something shifted. And once global systems internalize that pressure is no longer decisive, they redesign engagement strategies accordingly. Influence becomes situational, cooperation narrows, and the geometry of power changes not overnight, but durably. Which brings us to the most consequential question of all. What happens next? From here, the future does not unfold as a single path. It branches. The first scenario is stabilization. Pressure gives way to recalibration. Washington slows down, re-anchors commitments, and rebuilds durability into agreements. Predictability returns gradually, not through rhetoric, but through behavior that institutions can trust over time. Deals take longer, but they hold. In this world, leverage still exists, but it is exercised sparingly as reinforcement, not as a substitute for credibility. The second scenario is managed drift. Nothing breaks, but nothing fully repairs. Negotiations remain cautious, agreements stay conditional, allies comply, but later and less completely. Cooperation continues, but with thicker safeguards and fewer assumptions of finality. Power still functions, but less efficiently. This is not decline, it is friction normalized. The third scenario is erosion. Urgency continues to replace durability. Speed continues to be mistaken for strength. In that environment, institutions stop rushing altogether. Waiting becomes the default response. Pressure produces learning, not compliance. Influence doesn't disappear, it thins. Transaction by transaction, precedent by precedent. Which scenario emerges depends on one variable institutions care about most, whether commitments feel structural or tactical. Systems can tolerate pressure, they cannot tolerate unpredictability for long. And that distinction will determine whether this moment becomes a correction or a template. The answer lies not in what is said next, but in what is consistently done. Which brings us to the end. Step back, and the personalities fade quickly. What remains is a lesson about how power actually operates when institutions, not leaders, are doing the real work. Canada's refusal was not a rupture. It was a stress test. And the result was quietly conclusive. It showed that credibility now matters more than leverage, that predictability outperforms pressure, and that institutions adapt faster than political narratives admit. For much of the post-war era, American power benefited from an assumption of permanence. Commitments were expected to hold long enough to justify compromise. That assumption functioned as invisible capital. It reduced transaction costs. It made urgency effective. What this moment revealed is not collapse, but thinning. When commitments feel provisional, pressure stops accelerating agreement and starts incentivizing delay. Canada did not expose this reality alone. It simply demonstrated it clearly. Others observed, systems learned, behavior adjusted, no one panicked, and that is precisely why it matters. Power today is less about forcing agreement than sustaining belief. Belief that terms will endure, that concessions will not be reopened, that compliance actually ends negotiation. If this analysis changed how you see negotiation, leverage, or credibility, stay with me. Because the next video goes deeper into what durable power looks like in an age where everyone has learned how to wait. And once you see that, you won't look at pressure the same way again.